Hello, everyone. My name is Jabari Hinton, and this is my presentation over the sensory evaluation of a plant-based entree. So, starting off, here's a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. So, starting off with functional foods. So, functional foods are those foods that provide health benefits beyond basic nutrition. So, these are foods that may have supplements or additives added to provide benefits that help towards stress or oxidative stress and things of that nature. Right now, there's about a $1.7 trillion market for functional foods, and it should increase to about 2.6 trillion by 2027. So for the purposes of this presentation, functional foods can include anything from fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes. And specifically for this presentation, plant proteins in the use or being used as functional foods will be discussed. So here's a quick figure showing the increase in demand or market for plant proteins. As you can see, from 2017 all the way to 2028, the market share or market size for plant proteins will increase significantly in that time span. So an introduction into sensory evaluation. So according to IFT, sensory evaluation is a discipline that evokes, measures, analyzes, and interprets those characteristics within foods that can be perceived by the five senses, which are taste, sight, hearing, and touch. And these sensory or these senses will be used within our sensory panel for them to provide feedback on our or for my product. So an introduction into sensory tests, there are three common ones. I'm starting with an acceptance test that falls or pair comparison falls up under that, where you would have two samples or two products, and the consumer or panelists would be charged to basically pick which one has the highest acceptance between the two. So this includes a forced choice test. Secondly, there is a difference test, so a duo trio, which involves three samples, one being a reference sample and two being two separate ones and or different samples, and the consumer or panelists will be charged to figure out which one of those two are similar to the reference. Next, going to a triangle test. This also involves three samples. Two are the same, one is different, and they're charged with determining which one of these are different out of those three. And lastly, our preference tests, and this includes a hedonic scale, which is used to indicate the extent of like or dislike of a particular product or a particular attribute within a product. And this is the test that was used for this study. So the objectives of this study, one was to determine the extent of like or dislike that panelists had for the sensory characteristics of the plant-based entree, and two, to conduct an objective analysis on the characteristics of the plant-based entree. So starting with the materials and methods, a 5-point hedonic scale was used for panelists to rate the characteristics of the plant-based entree, with 1 being disliked very much and 5 being liked very much. Secondly, this is the equipment that was used for the objective analysis, texture, a CT3 texture analyzer, a color flex easy colorimeter, and a Rotronic water activity meter. So in preparation for the sensory panel, there were 26 panelists, and the image you see on the right is how the entire entree will be presented in its final form. But for the purposes of this study, the attribute or the components that you see here were given one per component in a sample form to each panelist. They were frozen initially, and then they were reheated in a microwave and served to each panelist. So looking at the subjective results for interest of time, the results for the meatball of the plant-based entree will be discussed here. So looking at the responses of the panelists, this component of the entree received very favorable responses from the panelists. Looking at overall acceptability for responses that were like a little to like very much, you'll see that majority of panelists rated the meatball highly in those areas, as well as for color, texture, mouthfeel, and overall flavor. So there was a general like for this particular component of the plant-based entree. So looking at the statistical analysis of this subjective data, so for interest of time, only the overall acceptability of the meatball will be discussed here. So you can see here from the bar charts that between responses of dislike a little, like very much, neither like nor dislike, and like very much, there were significant differences between each of those responses, which means that these responses were likely not due to chance or guess. It's very likely that the responses that were given were because those panelists did truly like or like a very much or like a little the overall acceptability of the meatball. And you can see here on the right, this statistical data was captured using the SAS program. You can see in this bottom table that the p-value for all these responses in the table were highly significant, with the p-value being far less than 0.05. So for the objective statistical analysis, for interest of time, the hardness of the meatball will be discussed here. So over a 3-day period, shelf life was conducted for each component. And for here, the meatball showed that for hardness from day 0 to day 3, there were significant differences between those days. So this shows that between day 0 and day 3, there was a very significant difference in the hardness of the meatball as it started to deteriorate during storage. So in conclusion, looking at the results that we've seen here today, the plant-based entree received the most favorable overall feedback in regards to its overall acceptability. We did find that there were mistake here, but there were significant differences in the meatball hardness, but more work would need to be done to rerun shelf life to make sure that those results that were obtained were consistent enough, and there was no human error that happened on that front. But future work on the formulation of each different component of the plant-based entree would be needed and tested further in sensory analysis to make sure that the plant-based entree in totality is acceptable for consumers.